Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first Restorative Justice webinar of this fall season. And this webinar marks our first in our third year of webinars in restorative justice from the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice at EMU's Center for Justice and Peace Building. So welcome, everybody. I'll let the host, Howard Zehr, do some more introductions here in a minute, but I'll just do a brief introduction of myself and talk a little bit about the software because that's my role in this particular webinar session. My name is Brian Gum, and I'm the Online Education Design Specialist for Eastern Mennonite University, and I'm actually a telecommuter. So EMU is in Harrisonburg, Virginia in the United States, and I am located in the state of Iowa, which is in the Midwest part of the U.S. So I work in online education for Eastern Mennonite University, but I'm also a former student of Howard's. I went through the MA in Conflict Transformation program at EMU, along with a seminary education also at EMU from 2008 to 2012. So I've been working now for EMU for the past 2 years in this role. And part of that work has included helping out with the technology in these webinars. So it's always a great pleasure for me to be able to help out because I certainly have a passion for restorative justice. I've had an opportunity to teach at the college level a few times in RJ, so it's very much near and dear to my heart. And so, but what I'm going to do here before turning it over to Howard is just kind of talk about the format of this webinar series and how you can participate in the discussion. Now, the way the audio and video works, you will see and hear us as panelists, but we will not see or hear you as viewers. But we do want to hear from you. And so the way that you can participate in the discussion, and I see a number of you have already found this button, is that there's a Q&A button in the bottom, in the row of buttons across the bottom of the Zoom window. It's kind of over toward the right side. It says Q&A. And if you click that button, you'll be able to type in questions that get sent to us as panelists. And then Howard will be keeping an eye on those and moderating those and then bringing those into the discussion at various points. And so that's how we would love to hear from you, and so you can have a voice in this conversation. So again, I welcome you all and hope you enjoy it, and I'll turn things over to Howard.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks to all of you for joining us. It's exciting to be here for our first one of the season. It's also the first time we've used this new technology. We've changed platforms, and we've had some glitches this afternoon. So if we end up with some little issues, bear with us. Yeah, I'm really glad to introduce this topic. I'm going to try to now put a PowerPoint up here, and I think this should work here. Let's see. Okay, I think we're here, except we're in the wrong slide. There we go. So the topic today is opportunities and dangers implementing restorative justice in existing systems. And this is a topic that's just been at the heart of the field right from the beginning. I mean, it partly relates to what are the tensions there? Is it a good idea to implement within the system? Should it be outside the system? These things have been debated for years, and they get increasingly important in today's world where restorative justice is growing so quickly and so expansively. So today we have 3 people to talk about this, and they're really highly qualified for this. They're also friends. There are 3 friends, and they're my friends, so it's a real honor to be able to do that. Introduce them briefly. Catherine Bargen has been involved in restorative justice for many years. She came to CJP and got her master's, but she had a long experience before she came, including in schools. She's done a book, as you can see there, on implementing restorative justice in schools. From 2001 to 2008, she worked with Langley, British Columbia's Fraser Region Community Justice Initiatives. And before that, she was with Mennonite Central Committee in Canada doing victim offender conferencing. She's in the Vancouver area. She's worked and trained in lots of diverse settings, including with kids from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Aboriginal settings, both youth and adult. She's a skilled and really energetic trainer. I've had the honor of teaching with her. We co-taught a course in SBI. She's so energetic and engaging that I think I was really her assistant in that course. Her job currently is she's Restorative Justice Coordinator for the province of British Columbia's Ministry of Justice. So she's working with programs, many of which are outside the system, but she's within the system. And she's had experience on both sides. Now, Aaron Lyons also has had long involvement in restorative justice. Let me change slides here. And he's a CJP grad. When he was here for his practicum, he went to New Zealand and worked with a Maori facilitator, and he was convening and facilitating family group conferences in that context. He had a lot of mediation, restorative justice experience before and after he did his graduate program. Currently, he's with Fraser's CJI program, where Catherine used to work, working particularly with severe violence dialogue programs. Fraser CJI program is one of the pioneers in severe violence dialogue in North America. He's a skilled trainer and educator. One time when I was going to teach an SBI course, my co-teacher got sick at the last minute, and I called on Aaron, and he came in with 24 hours notice or something, and did a wonderful job helping me teach that. He's an outdoorsman, a kayak guide, and a trainer of leadership in that context. One time while he was taking a program here, he suddenly disappeared for a while, and it turns out he was down in Chile or Peru, somehow teaching leadership to extreme kayaking to a group down there. Matthew is our token American in this context. He's living in Portland. He too is a CJP grad. While he was here, he became concerned that those of us teaching at CJP weren't always on the same page with our concepts. And so he actually organized a palaver, a gathering where we talked with each other and shared our perspectives. It was very helpful. He's the past president of a dynamic restorative justice coalition of Oregon, and has helped organize the Northwest Forum on Restorative Justice over the past years. He too is an experienced trainer and facilitator in restorative justice and mediation, and has a real interest in organizational. Part of his training here was in organizational leadership. Earlier, he worked from a community-based program in Oregon. Now he's the Restorative Justice Coordinator for Clackamas County Juvenile Department in Portland, where he's done major work at introducing restorative justice and helping develop programs for severe violence there. He's an outdoorsman too. He's a rock climber. When he was here, he used to lead groups of our students climbing the rocks. The three of them have just organized a new initiative. Here I am way behind here. You know, I can't multitask, I guess, at my age. They've a new initiative called Just Outcomes, and I will ask Matthew at some point in here to talk about that initiative, that organization. But you can see why these are appropriate people for our concept, our discussion, our topic today, because they have such experience both inside the system and outside the system. So with that, I'm going to try to turn this over to Matthew, and you can take it from here in whatever way you want.
Perfect. Looks like we're on screen. Well, I have the privilege of saying some introductory words to you all, and I just want to welcome you first to this session. It's certainly a privilege for us to get to share some things with you. And I think that probably many of us would be drawn to a webinar like this one out of a concern and a passion for really how justice is done in the big picture in our society. So the way that justice is understood and practiced is of concern to us. And I think as we grapple with that question, as we will today, you know, there are different theories at play as to why or how change can happen. And I mean, you know, some of us might come from a school of thought where you know, systems themselves are decaying. Some of us might come from a belief that these systems don't have a chance, and that what we really need to do is to build what we call life rafts, alternative approaches that are well intact and can be examples of how to organize around community, but also organize around justice if and when those systems eventually just give out. Sort of the permaculture idea in agriculture is a parallel to that of looking at how do we create life rafts so that when the current agricultural system is no longer working, that we have other ecological approaches. So there's that school of thought. Some of us would take it farther and say, as some of the leaders of peacemaking circles initiatives in the Yukon might say, that systems themselves are the problem. They're not the solution. And that when we focus on system change, we're not actually putting our energy in the right place, because systems are not humanizing by their nature, and they bring us away from what it is to really be human. So that systems are in conflict with restorative justice and should not be the focus. I think there's also a school of thought which says that the way to change systems is from within. And I think a lot of the people who hold jobs in the field of restorative justice would maybe implicitly be a part of an approach like that, where the best way we can do it is to slowly shape things according to some core values, and really if we don't try to change systems, well then systems will stay the same and keep intervening in perhaps negative ways with justice. So I think it's fair to say, somewhat by way of introduction, that we, as the three of us, don't have a kind of a unified theory of everything, or of what creates system change most effectively. What we do have is some lived experience. I think it's fair to say that our approach is a combination of what makes each of our heart beat, what excites us, what seems to work, what opportunities we have right in front of us to affect some change, and then also what pays the bills so that we can keep doing the work.
So hopefully, am I muted? Nod if you hear me, Aaron. Okay, I was, and I had started the PowerPoint and I couldn't tell. So the question then is, what is the issue we're going to talk about today? And basically what it comes down to, as Aaron was saying, is in our work, we run against the fact that we live and work in cultures that really value systems, at least the cultures the three of us work in. And inherently, systems, when they're created, they foster categories, uniformity, standardization, hierarchies, roles, and often even have outcomes that protect against worst-case scenarios, which inevitably are things that restorative justice simply is not. It's almost the antithesis of this. So there's an inherent conflict between RJ and systems. However, we also know that restorative justice is only as good as people get an opportunity to experience it. So we have the reality that our cultures, our communities value systems, and we need to find ways for them to get an opportunity to experience and access restorative justice. Therefore, this creates the negotiation that needs to take place between restorative justice as a field and the systems that currently, lead our responses to harm and crime. So just like negotiating with a hostage taker, there are all kinds of ethical and practical questions that arise in that negotiation. And ultimately, what we want to talk about in this presentation is, what we've learned in our own negotiations with systems and RJ as we've taken this journey over the course of the last decade or more. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Aaron, and we'll start with our first question.
We have some very light and very narrow-minded questions here, as you can see. What is the role of leadership and champions in creating system change? So this, of course, raises a lot of thoughts. I think many of us will know either through studies or intuitively that somehow real system change has to combine the efforts of leadership, those in positions of authority, and the grassroots or constituents, people who are affected by those decisions. And so, obviously we can't pin change on just one side of that triangle or that equation or the other. There's got to be a sort of a synergy or a dance, if you will, between the two. As I think about my own personal experience, I mean, one of the most stark examples of an attempt by leadership to create change was, Howard mentioned New Zealand. And as some of you might be aware, that the New Zealand government back in the 80s really took a step back from its justice process and looked at how well is it serving the minority citizens of that country, and particularly Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. And through a process of leadership combined with a process of real listening to individuals in the Maori community, there was some legislative change that came out. In 1986, after several meetings, I actually brought with me today a publication that was done called co-optation. It's very faint there, but this is, and the English word is daybreak, in which they make a series of recommendations about how justice, youth justice and child protection could be better and more culturally sensitive. And at the core of that was really putting families at the heart of the process and looking at how do we empower families rather than take young people out of their care. So here we had a process, and of course, my description here would risk over glamorizing. I think there's those who would certainly caution against painting the New Zealand process in too glossy of a light. But nevertheless, in terms of the mentorship and lessons that I had there from a Maori who was working a long time in the system, this is how the story was told to me. And I think really what was interesting in New Zealand about legislative change, which involved leadership, was that there was a listening. There was a listening and a real commitment to listening to the people whose voices most needed to be heard, to Maori individuals, thousands of them who were asked to speak at meetings and give input into the legislation. So there's always, of course, unintended consequences to these types of initiatives. And I think in the New Zealand context, we have to be aware that because it was leadership driven initially, and there was so much leadership involvement, that what are the unintended consequences of that? What implications might that have? And the issue of colonization is a big one, I think, is anytime we implement change from above, and particularly in indigenous communities, but also in non-indigenous areas, I think it's important to recognize to what extent is a restorative justice implementation process sort of paving over existing narratives and people, and to what extent is it really living out the values of respect and collaboration. And even in a legislated change like what happened in New Zealand, there's a mixture, right? I mean, you've got a piece of legislation that goes quite far in the direction of empowerment, and yet how justice is practiced in given communities and contexts by given people will all have a role to play in how it's perceived. And so that's something that we have to contend with in terms of the role that leaders do play is how responsive are we being, and how thoroughly can we seat ourselves as listeners and leaders at the same time. I'll speak just briefly about a counterexample, which actually there's some parallels there, which is the example of Nunavut. This is a territory, the newest territory in Canada. The opportunity to be working with some of the government specialists there who are wanting to implement a more restorative approach to community justice currently. And we're right in the process of sort of training and consulting and discussing these issues. And there, the government is also playing quite a role as a leader, and is creating new manuals for people and training processes for people on the ground. And at the same time, one of the key challenges that leaders in Nunavut have is how to make sure that community buy-in is there, and more than just buy-in, but involvement. How to make sure that this is not just a process of you will comply, and now there's restorative justice is the new way. But really, what does that mean to you? What does it look like? and how is justice done most meaningful. And in that context, it has a lot to do with how does it square with communities' cultural values, which are ancient. So these are some of the challenges. BC is a whole different story, probably on the flip side of what we've been talking about, and maybe we'll let Catherine take on a bit of that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so British Columbia is the province that Aaron and I both live in, and I work, as Howard mentioned, directly with the provincial government in BC, and BC is known for its grassroots contingent. So there's a culture here of people that are feisty, that care, that are willing to really stick their necks out to see restorative justice grow and thrive. And on the other hand, we also have a government that is supportive in many ways, but hasn't really stepped up to the plate in the way that you perhaps heard described by Aaron, by New Zealand or Nunavut, to really implement. And yet we still have this really strong grassroots. So things are happening. We see we've been leaders in certain areas of moving restorative justice forward in Canada, in British Columbia, as Howard mentioned, the serious and violent crime. We have probably the largest number of programs, a lot of grassroots interest. So trying to bridge that gap between the grassroots and government is been one of the bigger challenges in British Columbia. That said, we also finding that, when we're talking about restorative justice, what are you talking about? Some people will say, oh, well, we do restorative justice because we have these offender rehabilitation programs. Some say, well, that's not exactly restorative justice. We're talking about victim-offender dialogue. And others might say, well, we're actually advocating for circles of support and accountability programs for sex offenders. So we also have this, when you're moving something forward, is the government, are the grassroots, are you actually talking about the same things? Are you sharing the same language? And we certainly don't have a solution to that. It's more, we're at the point of identifying what is it we all want to see here, and how can we narrow in on what we're talking about. So in terms of the takeaways from this section that I'd like you to just consider, I'd say both Aaron, Matthew, and I, in preparing for this, realized that a big piece around leadership is look for opportunities to bring the grassroots and leadership together on equal playing ground. So you're looking for conferences to bring people together. You're looking for meetings that might bring folks together, any events where people can come together as equals and share ideas without being seen as a threat to one another. So along that same line, not keeping it separate. Don't make it like we have grassroots community here and we have systems over there, and like grassroots don't like the systems and the systems are skeptical of the grassroots. Instead, we need to say, like, what do we each have to offer to moving forward, and actually see each other as allies in moving something forward rather than pitting one against each other, which is a temptation within many systems. In the interest of time, let's keep moving forward.
Indeed. All right, so the next question, where does one begin when considering systems change? Is it more important to focus on program development or organizational community culture change? So this question has been really heavy on my mind for about the last year. In reflection over my 4.5 years at the juvenile department. And so I want to start by giving you some context. I was brought in 4.5 years ago as a restorative justice coordinator with the intention from leadership to create programs that would better serve the stakeholders or our clients within the juvenile department. And they were including in that list victims, offenders, and community. So when I came in, there was an enormous amount of resource and support from leadership to really build these programs. And I faced no resistance or roadblocks in terms of what I needed to build a program manual, for example, and develop policies and procedures. And however, I come from a paradigm which really says, we need to include everyone that's going to be impacted by this, of course. So I did reach out and engage and try to provide a voice to the line staff, the probation officers, administrative staff within the department.
Sucking into it all other efforts. And it's a real challenge. I'm not sure about the context of all of you listening, but certainly here in BC, there's a lot of fear about that. And, even when, Catherine mentioned one of our challenges at a grassroots level here, trying to organize and come to some idea of how do we raise a collective voice about advancing the project of restorative justice. Well, one of the fears about having any sort of unification or a body or an association of any kind among community groups is that, well, as soon as you do that, then it could be taken over by somebody, or it's possible that then it gets sidelined by those in power. So that is a real fear for many people. Where currently, again, we're talking about sort of what's most current in our work. The Nunavut example is one where co-optation is a risk as well. There you have three really different justice paradigms at play. You have the Western European justice system, which has been in place for the last 100, 150 something years. You have traditional Inuit justice. So these are the Aboriginal people of the North, or one of them. And there's a whole cultural practice around justice, which they likely wouldn't call justice, but call other things. And then restorative justice being introduced. And these are all values and principles and processes that are having to square off in some way in this playing field. And of course, that's really complicated. And in our context, there is a risk of the logic of the system sort of governing over criminal justice processes and really just of bureaucracies in general. I think it's not too controversial to say that big bureaucracies and systems, and generally speaking, like a degree of uniformity. They like when things are standardized. They like when things are packaged, and when they know how things are going to easily flow within the system. It's not just individuals who like that, it's the logic of the system. And so it's very easy in an implementation process like what's happening in Nunavut for there to be a focus on process. What does it look like to do restorative justice? How do we create a good training manual so that people know exactly what to do, right? And I think historically those types of efforts in Nunavut have failed because they're not responding well to the actual needs of people and communities, and they're not responding culturally. So what our mentors have taught us, Howard being one and others, is that to have these conversations well, we often need to really focus on values. And instead of just focusing on process, process is really an outcome of being well-grounded into a set of values and constantly negotiating with them and asking the question of how do they operationalize, what do they mean in action. And so the really interesting challenge personally in Nunavut has been, how do we go about these conversations in ways that are values-based? How do we talk about restorative justice, Indigenous justice, in ways that involve people in those deep conversations? And instead of imposing what might maybe be easier for a system, which is just, here's a new process for you and it's called restorative justice, now get to it. So that's a bit of a lesson learned. Over to you.
Over to me. I like Aaron's language around the logic of a system. In BC, in British Columbia, we have the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is our federal police system. And those folks out there that are American, you'll know them as the red outfits, the hats on the horses. Hat like Farrell wore to the Grammys. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So we're actually quite fortunate in BC that the provincial detachment of our federal police are very supportive of restorative justice and have been for quite some time, about a decade. And because of that, and because they're well-resourced, have really helped shape what restorative justice looks like in British Columbia. They have their own process that they learned from the Australian system, where the police are also big leaders in restorative justice, called community justice forums. And So it's been an interesting tension there, a healthy tension, because a lot of the change and the culture change, the system is being pushed by a police-based logic to some extent, which, as you can imagine, I won't go into all that, has some values that align with restorative justice and others that are more of a challenge for restorative justice. There's criticism that there's too much focus on the offender. There's a critique that it's very authority-based. We may have a circle, but when it comes down to it, we're going to decide what happens. That those things are at play, and not in all cases, but they are at play because of the system of a police-based model being strong, showing some strong leadership for restorative justice in British Columbia. So that's one of the tensions that we manage around the idea of co-optation in BC. Matthew?
Yeah, so just two additional things that I found in my work around this issue of co-optation. The first thing I'll just acknowledge is, when I was in school with Howard, this issue came up several times, and it was always like, oh, yeah, that's dangerous, and we need to watch out for it. But then it was kind of like, I'm sure I'll know when that's happening. And what I found is it's much more subtle than that, and that we actually do have to be very careful as practitioners, and especially very reflective. Two examples, two issues that have come up for me. One, there's this mantra in our work about speaking a language that the listener can hear. And while that makes some sense, you want to be able to connect relationally and with others' experience. I've also found it can be a bit dangerous. We can, in our attempt to mold the language of restorative justice, actually fall outside of alignment, I think. And a good example of that is when I came on board here, the entire juvenile justice statute in Oregon is built around the balanced approach, which I've learned a whole history of that, and I'm not going to go into that. But that was here before restorative justice was here. And when RJ came on board, they took the three elements of the balanced approach and put it on the restorative justice triangle without the stakeholders. And those three elements are community safety, which links with community, capacity building, which links with the offenders, and in this case, youth offenders, and accountability, which they linked with victims. And so there's pressure from, just in general in this area to speak that language. The problem with that, at least I found, is that victims aren't explicit in that conversation. And so, we struggled with that conversation. I pushed back a little bit, and we ended up using the language of the triangle. So those little decisions around how we talk about it, people like Howard and the many others that have come before us and put an immense amount of reflection and work and time into molding a language that truly does reflect the values and principles of restorative justice. We need to pay heed to that, I think, to some extent. And then the other thing is just in program development, there's been many times where in conversation with leadership, with line staff, there's been pressure to make a program structural decision based on what will help it be successful in the system. That makes a lot of sense through that lens, but then again, when taking the time to reflect, it doesn't make as much sense in terms of its alignment with RJ. Quick example is one of the things we face is in our victim offender dialogue program, there was a really healthy discussion around should we or can we allow the juvenile court counselors or probation officers to be a part of the dialogues. And at face value, they get to experience it, they get to then buy into it, there's probably going to be more referrals, so on and so forth. But then the other side of that coin is the power dynamics, the safety in the room, all of that stuff. So I think we came to good conclusions around that, but it really took us on both sides, of that coin being very reflective and conscious in that decision-making process. So just to be careful that often it can be very subtle.
And
Catherine.
now we're at our conclusion. So I hope you've, don't spoil the plot just yet, Matthew.
Oh.
I hope you've gained something by listening to what essentially is a lot of the struggling we've done at the systems level. And I hope you've also heard that we don't have super clear answers. We tried to provide takeaways for you to think about how to frame some of these issues. But as our first bullet point says, you have to manage your tensions. Howard, right at the beginning, said there's always a tension, systems and grassroots, and we don't have any conclusions on how to solve that. It's a matter of managing that tension and being very cognizant of it. So in that way, next bullet point, please. I want to make sure it's the right one before I go. So you're constantly looking. I've received this advice within the system even. Look for the openings in the system that are ripe for culture change. So again, you're not trying to tear the system down and rebuild it. You're looking to navigate the system. Maybe there's some people that you found you can work well with. Maybe there's a new program that opened that you notice has real alignment with restorative justice values. Go there. So you're looking for openings within the system that are ripe for culture change and working within that, or you end up working really hard like Matthew did, creating that culture. He found a ripeness for people to sit in circles. So start there. Just look where you think there might be some ripeness around that culture change. And finally, it's almost cliche within restorative justice, but I'm amazed how often I come back to this. It's about building relationships. If you can find people that are champions, work with those, you can truly work at all levels. You'll be working with top levels, you'll be working with grassroots, and when you can make it fun, make it an event, you will find that people show a willingness to change their mind about how they approach perhaps a narrow systems approach. And in that way, you will truly become a peace builder and not just a restorative justice practitioner. And that is our conclusion. Thank you.
So, Howard, do you want me to talk about this slide now, or would you?
Hold on a little bit. Let's come back to it. Just
Okay.
I can leave it up there if you want to, or I can go pull it back up.
Yeah, I'll pull it back up.
Well, that's fascinating. Catherine, I remember when you started your job, the newbie, and they're looking at ways to build relationships and some of the challenges of it. It's really important and it's really challenging. You have a good personality for it, so that helps.
Well, karaoke helps, so you always invite me to exciting events.
we have two questions here, which you can see, but I'm going to read for the sake of the participants, and I'd encourage the rest of you to send questions in. I know they answered a lot of questions. Maybe you don't have any more questions, and maybe you're awed by the technology, but we'd like to have questions. So first question is coming from Brazil. I am performing a research here in Brazil regarding the compatibility of the restorative justice methodology and procedures involving the occurrence of culpable crimes. It's been proving very promising until now. I'm starting the empirical research, and I believe that this is one way of gradually deconstruct the current paradigm by showing people that the restorative justice perspective, that is, regarding the way it conducts the resolution of issues, is more efficient and human. I believe the community and institutions are more open to changes regarding procedures involving culpable crimes, especially because of the lack of intention of the offender and the fact that the media doesn't demonize those crimes as much as the ones performed willingly. Would you consider this as a hole in the institutional body, which might be worth exploring? What do you think of the idea? I'm not positive about the term culpable crime, and maybe a person could add that in, but I think it's probably an unintentional or with a reduced intentionality, if I understand it. I'm not sure what kind of crimes those, whether that it would include. I'm not sure what that includes. But do you have enough sense of it to take a go on it?
Taking another look at the question.
Yeah, I mean that was my initial response as well, Howard, just wondering what culpable is referring to. What I will say is just reflecting, that's great, the research. I mean, I think that's an area that the field has been a bit weak in over the decades. But so I think we need to find ways to really do that. And I think that's part of being a reflective practitioner as well, is taking the time to build systems of monitoring, evaluation, all of that stuff, and to provide the research. So that's great.
There's that comment that says this does mean non-intentional crimes. I might add that when this field started, the philosophy was that we should start with the lesser offenses because people would be more open to it. And to my experience, there was some truth to that. But the problem was we got locked in to see, perception was then restorative justice was for lesser crimes.
Right.
And yet what we know from the research is the more serious crimes are more impactful, restorative justice is more impactful. Any more comments around that question? Is this questioner right? Is this a good place to start on what at least we might consider lesser or less obvious crimes?
Well, Howard, I appreciate you saying that, because one of the big things I learned from you is always look at the unintended consequences of your actions. So if you do start in that and say, hey, yeah, that does look like a place ripe for culture change with these culpable crimes, realize, as Howard just said, that you may end up creating an image of restorative justice that it's only for people who didn't really mean it in the first place. But sometimes just wriggling your way into the system is a great way to start.
All right, should we move on to another question? And we can come back to that one if we have more insight on. Here's a comment. Looks like it might be from Japan. I like the comment about being a peace builder. I'm part of a peace building circle in a court system. It's challenging but important. Here's a question. Any advice for building relationships towards restorative justice with long time and old school prosecutors? In other words, how do you work with Crown prosecutors or prosecutors who have been at this for a long time and have their ways of working, they're schooled in the old ways of doing it? Any suggestions for that?
I'll just say the first thing you should do is follow Fred Van Loo's blog. He's a prosecutor, and I've actually learned quite a bit by reading what he writes. So I'll just say that for now and think about it a little bit here. Aaron, Catherine?
I would just add, like in any relationship, in a really genuine way, find out what's important to the person you're talking to. What is it that's of concern to them? The people working in the system the longest are perhaps to the greatest extent aware of some of the gaps and the holes and the needs that are still needed to be filled. Certainly in the nonprofit work that I do with community justice initiatives, there's a lot of Crown prosecutors out there who would love to see more restorative justice options in our system. Because they know that there's limitations in terms of what they can recommend and what they can do currently. So judges the same. So they understand the issues to a large extent, and I think our stance is initially, like any conversation, should be one of listening. And to some extent, I think forget about restorative justice for a little while and just focus on what it is that they're saying, what it is that they are expressing, and see if there's an intersect in terms of what you do.
And if I can just add to also ask what they need. Where do they see the gaps in the system? Where are the places that they feel fall short, and can restorative justice potentially fill those needs or those gaps? One other quick thing is, in terms of systems change, thinking broadly about that in terms of even going up beyond prosecutors, defense attorneys, and looking at legislatively how you can make it easier for them to buy in. And so, for example, one thing we've been talking a lot about in Oregon here is how do we create a statute? We have a statute of confidentiality for mediation, but it does not involve victim offender dialogue. So of course you have issues of Miranda rights when you're talking about dialogue in court cases pre-adjudication and disposition. So how can you create legislation that ultimately makes it easier for prosecutors and defense attorneys to allow their clients to participate in these kinds of programs that do align with restorative justice values and principles.
We'll try to find Fred's log address and put it up here. But I will say Fred is a former longtime prosecutor from Iowa who did restorative justice in his role as a prosecutor, and now as a big restorative justice advocate helping communities in Maine and Iowa and other places get started. And so we'll try to get his website here. But he comes with long experience at this. I used to think prosecutors was a big problem, but now the prosecutors pointed out that often defense attorneys are a bigger problem than they are. And I think there's some truth to that too. Here's a comment. Someone says, doesn't storytelling help too? That's what helped me explain. It's so experiential. So sometimes when you can't, I think, Catherine, what he's saying is when you can't actually help somebody experience it, at least the stories help. Would you agree?
I would totally agree. And sometimes I can come out maybe a little strong and then I pull back a bit and say, of course, tell the great stories. And there are people out there that will be receptive. I just feel that sometimes we think that we haven't told enough stories in restorative justice and that's why people aren't getting it. But I think there are some folks who are just have their ears closed in certain ways. But absolutely telling great stories, the transformational stories is important. Just like I tell my dad my stories of when I go to acupuncture and have a great experience. I know that. And who knows, maybe one day he'll go. I think it would benefit him greatly, but he's going to have to experience it for himself.
But our critics often say that we tell too many butterfly stories, that is, these happy stories. And as one of your colleagues, one of our former students used to say, we need to balance that with bullfrog stories. Tell those stories where things didn't work so well, both to show reality, but also to learn from those situations.
Yeah, and to prevent people from thinking that restorative justice, if only we would use it, would solve all problems. I think sometimes as enthusiasts and as advocates, there can be this overemphasis on how well it works and all these. And so then when people hear about how it doesn't work, they're like, well, obviously you were just wrong. And so needing to be careful at saying this worked, this was amazing. Sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes it can be just sort of a run-of-the-mill conversation where people just get their questions answered and move on. Mm-hmm. Or people don't end up meeting and feel a little discouraged after. But where I have seen it work too is like this, so that people don't dismiss it when it doesn't go well, because we're not trying to say that it is flawless.
Yeah. And I would just add that we should be somewhat cautious, even strategic about the stories that we do tell. There's a lot of forgiveness stories out there.
Yeah, there sure are.
They often feel pretty invigorating to hear, and wow, look at human potential, and they're beautiful. But there's also, many examples of effective restorative justice work that have nothing to do with forgiveness, and I think that needs to be conveyed to people. Yeah. I'm just thinking of a dialogue I was a part of recently between a victim who lost a young child and the woman who took that child's life, and it was nothing to do with forgiveness. It wasn't really even about the character of the offender. It was about the mother really expressing her voice, and that was the part that was really the subject of the dialogue, and that was very freeing for her to have that opportunity, regardless of really how it was received or what or any of those issues. So I think examples like that are eye-opening, because first of all, they signify some of the breadth of what restorative justice is about, but also, and of course, Howard, you focus a lot on that in your work, is just focusing on needs rather than on some sort of kind of metaphysical ideal that you have prescribed for people. I hope that's an accurate paraphrase. But also, specifically here, looking at justice from the victim's perspective and what it is that she was coming in with. I think that's an important piece. Number one, because restorative justice is fundamentally about repairing harm to the people who've been affected. But also, if we're talking in a situation like here in Canada, where systemically victims' issues and concerns have actually more political momentum than those to do with offenders right now, it's important that we be clear about the work that we do and how it benefits victims and the grounding of it in that. So, yeah.
Let me jump ahead, just a comment that someone sent in, and then we'll go to another question. It says, in my area, the prosecutors are more open than is the professional victim community, which is highly organized. Any anecdotal or research-based suggestions there?
That's particularly an area that we are working on in BC, in British Columbia. And again, we're working at it from the relationship perspective. So we've held over the last 4 years, I believe, 3 provincial events, or regional events at least, bringing together restorative justice folks and the professional victim community in dialogue and in a listening style events. So you're asking for, I guess that's my anecdotal suggestion. It's not particularly research-based, but we're seeing some great results because we're able to build relationships in a more strong way. I don't have a latest update. I'm actually on maternity leave right now. So I don't
to say that you were a new mother. I forgot.
Yeah, I have a 3-month-old baby that Aaron's wife is looking after right now, so I don't have the latest on that, but it's been going very well for us in British Columbia to bring the communities together in dialogue, and with the restorative justice community really doing the listening.
It's great.
Okay, yeah, but so it's a lot of the same things you were talking about, building relationships, listening to needs, those kind of things, isn't it? We better keep moving here because the questions are coming in. Whoa, they are coming in. We're going to have trouble getting through that. One person says, I'd love to hear an actual story of how you began a restorative program in a school. I'm writing for Los Angeles. And another person about schools asks, what are some of the biggest challenges in working in schools? How did you overcome them? Is there something you could say short form on that?
Yeah, I won't even try to answer that because that book that I wrote in 2010 captured everything that I had learned, or like all my problems are in that. I sort of, before I moved on, that's it. Howard, thank you. Before I moved on to government, I'm like, I'm just going to capture some of the challenges and lessons. So I wouldn't call it a final solution and anything, but you can get that book on Community Justice Initiative's website. Howard, I don't know if you could post it on cjibc.org, and then go on the resources link and click on Educating for Peace Building, and that's the book that captures all those stories.
I don't know if we can post either. We're trying to figure out. Brian has sent by chat window the address of Fred's blog, but he's not sure whether new participants can see it or not. So, well,
it's I have posted it in the answers to the Q&A, and so in the answered tab of the Q&A section, I did post a link to Fred's blog, and it's an easy address to remember too. It's just called thejusticediary.com. And it's visible in the answers to the Q&A section. I'll also get a link to the website that Catherine mentioned for her book.
Just do it the old-fashioned way too here.
There you go. Nice. Look at that. That works. Okay, we got to keep going here. You got what's that?
A little backwards. Anyway.
No, it shows right here. It shows backwards, and I got thrown by that when I first started with this too. Okay, here's a question. Have you worked to implement restorative justice and its principles across systems simultaneously? In my context, we're looking at openings and receptivity in education and different criminal justice systems, corrections, policing, so forth. Any tips for working across systems and encouraging a sustained community-wide approach for restorative justice? I know there's some restorative justice city movements going on. Someone called me about one of those today. But anything else you have to add about that? And then she adds in parentheses, encouraging lay community voice as well as system voice.
So I have two current pilot projects that are right in line with that. And what we're doing, we've had diversion panels in our communities, 11 communities throughout our county. And what we have done is we've taken 2 of those panels and engaged in a process in which we're looking at how those communities respond to harm through diversion panel and asking, can we align that practice with restorative justice values and principles? But what we've done, and this is where it gets relevant to your question, Sharon, is we have engaged stakeholders. So we've pulled together a group of representative stakeholders, you could say. So we have law enforcement represented, faith community, nonprofit, school, juvenile justice, parent, family, those type of representatives, youth. Basically working together, we did a 2-day training on restorative justice values and principles with them. And then we're engaging over the course of a year to develop the program, the diversionary program, through the lens of restorative justice values and principles. So meeting once a month, talking about specific issues that are around program development, and then coming to conclusion as to how we want to practice together. And so far, it's been a really interesting experience. It's amazing the different ideas and different kind of bridges that are being built by bringing those groups together and talking about justice through a meaningful lens, through an open lens without barrier. And so that's an exciting project, I think, and an exciting framing of how to go about that kind of program development within a community that does cross systems and engages people, helps them to create a system that's meaningful to them as well.
Okay, anything else on that as we move to the next one? Here's a question. Given fear of unification and co-optation, can you imagine developing any sort of best practices that is beyond what we would understand to be fundamental values that aren't inherently problematic? So can we create best practices that aren't inherently problematic?
Well, I think we in BC will be able to report back on that better in some months or even years. I think that's a ripe conversation here. And what exactly goes into a conversation like that? What goes into a best practices book or manual that isn't too prescriptive and that isn't coming from sort of a dogmatic, kind of overly packaged approach. But it's also the case that we have to progress that conversation here in order for restorative justice to move ahead. It's very clear that for the people that refer to restorative justice in BC, they want to see that kind of thing. And even as a practitioner here, it's clear that there's a great deal of variety in terms of what people mean by restorative justice and how they envision that. So it's important we have the conversation and exactly where we draw the line between sort of a values-informed approach to best practice and then what's getting prescriptive and dogmatic and subject to the influences of power. Keep you posted.
I will say, too, that about 10 years ago, more even, maybe, anyway, a bunch of practitioners in BC got together and created something called the Charter for Restorative Justice. So rather than best practices, they framed it as like, this is what we hold to be our core values, and this is what we think is how we want to practice, and this is what we're putting out there. And then people could sign their name to it if they wanted to as something that they agreed with. And I like that, the vibrancy of that. It really was framed as being a living and breathing document. And it's something to experiment with. Is write one for yourself. What do you think your best practices are? And say, this is what I stand for right now. I'm open to further suggestions. I think that's the spirit of restorative justice too.
And if I can add just two quick things, Howard. One is, and I'm not going to know the title, Catherine, you or Aaron probably can pull it out of your heads, is the manual that Susan Sharp wrote. I think that's certainly relevant and a resource available to people.
Oh yeah, that's a good manual.
Restorative Justice, a vision for healing and change.
I think he means walking the talk.
Oh, walking the
yes.
talk. From the BC one. That is also on the CJIBC.org website called Walking the Talk, Developing Ethical Frameworks for Restorative Justice Practices.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah. And I've always go ahead, man.
Just one more thing, Howard, just to say, to show how this is really relevant in terms of systems change. I was talking to a lawyer just yesterday who's a part of a advocacy agency that works on legislative change. And one of the changes they've been looking at is creating a victim right legislatively that allows victims to request the right to meet with their offender. they keep putting that off their strategic plan, because what they're seeing is, so that's great if that right is there, but if a victim requests that right in a program, there's no standards in Oregon, there's no best practice, there's no certification for facilitators. How do they know that that's going to be handled in a way that aligns with RJ values and principles? So it does apply to how much we can do system-wide. And I also agree it's a very difficult and challenging issue in this field.
I've always liked one of the statements of principle of practices that came out of New Zealand that connects each practice with a value. It's in Critical Issues in Restorative Justice that Barb Taves and I co-edited, but also I think it's on the New Zealand Ministry of Justice website, or at least it used to be. There's a related question here. We're going to go, by the way, maybe 5 minutes over today. I hope that those of you listening in will be able to stay with us since we started late. But we are getting toward the end of our time. So we'll need to, by 6 o'clock, we'll need to shift over to something else here. And so, Matthew, keep that in mind. If you want to say a little bit more about just outcomes, you should do a little bit before 6 here.
Got it.
Our time. But another question was relating to certifying facilitators. Can you do it? It's the same question really with this best practice. Can you do it in a way that's not problematic, is not co-opting, it doesn't end up with government controlling us and so forth? Any quick comments on that?
Well, Matthew, you guys are...
No, I was just going to reflect what you said earlier, that we'll know more. That's something we're toying with at a state level right now, but it's really challenging.
My hunch is that it'll make a big difference who the certifying body is and what the makeup of that is.
Yeah.
So that rather than it being one group or agency that has authority there, that somehow there's a collective process, so that there's less of a chance of it being kind of swept up into somebody's agenda. I think some sort of a board where there's combined expertise from different models, and can we be certifying? It's a very interesting question. I mean, can we be certifying around something more than skill at a process, but actually like being rooted in the values and how we work with people, because that's ultimately what seems to create change in relationships and a progress in terms of our work is how we are with people that we're working with, not just what we kind of do and how we funnel them through the system. So, those are some pretty intangible things to be trying to certify, and yet, we are left with the question of how to make sure that what we're doing is safe and ethical. So, big questions.
I'm always sobered by what I observed has happened here in Virginia with mediation field. That is, it's become more and more professionalized. The requirements get tougher and tougher. It's community volunteers are being pushed out because of that reason. It's getting highly controlled. And the creativity is just, if we'd had that kind of thing in place when we started, we'd never taken the risk. The people that did the first cases would never have been able to do it. So. I'm going to move on again here to a longish question. So great to see you all. Thank you for this fabulous conversation. You mentioned change by 3 things: life raft, do away with systems, incremental change within. What are life rafts? Can you clarify, please, and how does that differ from number 2, do away with systems? And then what are each of your personal beliefs right now in which of those 3 are the most effective and best use of our limited time and resources? And specifically, I'm curious if you honestly think we can ultimately change a very structured hierarchical system that is radically different from RJ, like a maximum security prison, through incremental change within. Like a short little question.
Well, I could kick us off with that one. I mean, the difference between life rafts and doing away with systems altogether, the intention there was that life rafts means creating new microsystems that can take the place of existing systems. So it's not a doing away with the notion of systems, but it's looking at what's a new system we can create that's alive and functioning and is working. We're testing it, while at the same time the dominant system is evolving or devolving in the way that it will. So yeah, doing away with the system would simply say, as soon as we systematize anything, we lose the plot. I think that's the intent there. What are our beliefs about what's most effective?
I have a thought.
Good.
Evelyn, I so appreciate these questions, and they're so you. And you know, you're a real change maker for BC. I'm kind of for the life raft model myself, simply because I see it work in other ways. Let's say not in the justice system, but as soon as a new system is working, people automatically go towards that and just naturally start using it as the norm. So, for example, we're seeing right now, again, I obviously make silly metaphors, but in Vancouver, you cannot find a DVD rental store anymore. They are gone. They are over. And I don't think any amount of change within the DVD rental system could have predicted its downfall the way that the creation of online streaming and rental could have done. So it's another approach that became so effective, so attractive, so user-friendly, that essentially it has shut down the Blockbusters and the Rogers Video. I don't know what you have in the United States, but we've got, I think Blockbuster was international. They're gone. And that's because there was an alternative that was so attractive. So I'm curious right now about the life raft model of creating new systems within the systems and seeing if they can draw the energy away from the existing system.
Interesting analogy.
Well, and that's great, Catherine, because that actually, you know, thinking through the diversion program that we're creating through that model I explained previously, like my hope, long-term vision for that is it will become so effective that we can begin to open up the referral kind of mechanism so that it can take more and more cases, which ultimately would be creating that life raft. And hopefully it becomes so successful that, you know, that we want to refer our cases to those programs. So that fits.
Good. Here's a question. We had a number of comments, which we'll read if we have time. Here's a question. It says, given that RJ is subject to a variety of definitions, this is a long time, this is a big debate, you know this one. How is it possible to create a consistent response that victims can understand what they both expect and anticipate if they choose to engage with restorative justice response to crime or harm? The question about varying definitions, and particularly as it relates to the delivery of service, I guess you want to use that language, to victims.
Rochambeau. Such a huge question.
It is an interesting one. You know, we did not while you're thinking there. We did this years ago. We had this grant. We did a listening project with victim services around the U.S. And then we brought representatives from the sites, and they had lots of different resistances. And finally, somebody said to me, "What is restorative justice?" And I explained what my concept of it, and everybody said, "Oh, I don't have any problem with that." But you know, there's so many different definitions of it out there that it's really confusing.
Well, I will say this. I have made it a mantra of mine, and I think this comes directly from you, Howard, is, you know, whenever I talk about restorative justice, every single presentation I give, every conversation I have, I always emphasize that it's a philosophy, not a program. And I think that's the biggest misperception that we have. I look even at the research, the different articles that come up. Research shows restorative justice lowers recidivism by X%, when really what they're talking about is a victim offender dialogue program, or victim offender dialogue programs, or conferencing, or peacemaking circles. And I think we've got to clear that up, because I think, you know, what you probably articulated in that listening project is a philosophy, and that is much easier to get behind and support and understand, I think. And there's the reality is people want the black and white, just give me the manual and let me know how to run with this. That's the challenge.
More nuanced language too. I mean, again, to me, it's really important to think of as a continuum. and there are some things that are more restorative than others. And it doesn't mean if they're not fully restorative, they're not worth doing. But it seems like we think something's restorative justice or it's not restorative justice. And so when it's partially, then it doesn't work right, and then we throw it out.
Right, absolutely.
Any other comments on that one?
Yeah, I would go out on a bit of a limb and say that I would hope any definition that becomes a consensus in our field would actually go so far as to place victims somewhere at the heart of what's being addressed by restorative justice. So the question was about how do we convey the definition to victims, and I think that absolutely, and this is why it's out on a limb, because others might have different views, but absolutely restorative justice needs to address offenders' needs, and it needs to address the root causes of offending behavior, and we can't do that through a single focus. But at the same time, the window, the opening into the conversation is a victim who was harmed by crime or some form of wrongdoing or harm within a system. So that becomes the starting place. And I think that, restorative justice, personally anyway, it's more true to itself when it can somehow in the definition give voice to that, as opposed to trying to be too flat about whose needs we're addressing first.
Well, let's start wrapping up, and Matthew, in just a minute, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then to Fabrice. I'm going to talk about what's coming up. There's a couple of suggested resources and so forth. Unfortunately, this new technology doesn't let us cut and paste it into any other document. But maybe we'll figure out a way to put some of these resources along with the recorded version on our website or something. We're still learning, and Brian is in conversation with the people who developed this platform to get some refinements to it. So we're pretty happy with it in general. But Matthew, why don't you tell us a little bit about Just Outcomes? I know you've been talking about this, planning it for a long time. It's exciting that you're launching it.
Yeah, thanks, Howard, and I'll be very brief, but because I don't want this to be a sales pitch by any means. But just to say, this is a consulting firm that Aaron and Catherine and I have been working on for over a decade now at a slow boil. So in many ways, this was a really exciting event for us, kind of monumentous after so many years. And, we're ready to go and excited about what we're really about is partnering with communities, criminal justice agencies, schools, corporations, anyone who's interested in the exploration of finding new and more meaningful ways of responding to harm and crime in their systems. And systems is really at the heart of what we want to be a part of. Catherine has used in the past the analogy of naturopathic medicine versus Western medicine. And we want to be the naturopaths in this work. We want to really look at the foundational symptoms and the issues underlying. So we're just really excited to make those partnerships and start walking alongside these folks. And there seems to be more and more of them that are interested in this journey. So there's our contact information. If anyone's interested or wants to pass that on, we'd be thrilled to hear from you.
Great. I'm glad to see you launch it. And I actually made a possible referral to you folks today. So who knows?
Nice.
Something to keep you busy. In addition to kids and all of that. Fabrice, let's go try turning it over to Fabrice, and then I'll come back for just a final word. See if that works. But if it doesn't, there he is.
All right.
I gotta cut my audio though. Hold on a minute.
Let me share this PowerPoint real quick.
And Matthew, you'll need to, okay, there we go.
Okay. All right. So one of the key things for me has been Summer Peace Building Institute, and this is where you can get more training on restorative justice. So I highly, really recommend to sign up for these classes, because SPI is 1 week intensive training, and you get to really dive into the theory and practice of restorative justice. There's one from May 4th to 12th, which is Restorative Justice, the Promise to Challenge. There's David Brubaker is teaching the next one from May 14th to 22nd, Developing Restorative Justice Organization. And Carl Stauffer is teaching Justice and Transition, Restorative and Indigenous Applications in Post-War. And that's going to be from June 4th to the 12th in 2015. And I really recommend you looking at for more information on SPI, because that's a really great opportunity to meet people from all around the world and really get into the nitty-gritty of what restorative justice is. And one of the programs that the Center for Justice and Peace Building does is the STAR training, which is the Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, which focuses mainly on trauma and really seeing what is trauma and how is it affecting systems, how is it affecting organizations, and more so ourselves. And that awareness really brings about a transformation within organizations, within groups. And I would really recommend, I took the STAR last spring and it really changed my life. So as you could see, there are many trainings still happening in 2015 from February 2 to 6, from May 25 to June 2nd, also at SPI. And for more information, please go online. All this information is online. You can definitely look for more of that. And also I'm currently a master's student in conflict transformation. I'm a second year. And one of the things, if you're interested in really, and you know anyone that's really trying to get this idea of transformation and really starting what conflict is and peace building is, I would highly recommend also looking into the graduate program, because it is such a really powerful program that really teaches you the tenets of peace building and conflict, and also applying very, very, very practical processes that really bridges theory and practice. So I really, really recommend, and you could definitely look at that. Also, I'm going to look at the next webinars. October 29th is going to be preparing restorative justice educators, a discussion of effective models. And this is going to be taught by Fania Davis and Kathy Evans. And this is going to be mainly focusing around education and how can you implement restorative justice in schools, because I know there was a lot of questions in this webinar about that. So you definitely want to tune in for that. And also there's one going to be integrating customary practice in restorative justice in Libya, will be by Najla Mengush, who's a Fulbright scholar studying currently at CJP. And she will be looking at how do we implement restorative justice within Libya. And on December 10th, we'll be looking at restorative justice by design. And this will actually look at space and how is space and architecture really impact the way we work towards implementing systems and processes of RJ. So these are very dynamic webinars that you definitely don't want to miss. So please go on the website and make sure to attend. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrice. Yeah, you can see we got some fascinating stuff coming up.
Howard, we can't hear you.
Oh, here I am. Yeah.
There you go.
Too many buttons to push here. I'm saying this has been a really rich and fascinating conversation. It will be recorded, and if it is recorded, it will be, people who want to see it again can watch it. It's on our website. Somebody said they couldn't find the Susan Sharp book on the CJP website. It's not on the CJP website, it's on the CJI website, Aaron's organization, where he works. But
we also, Howard, we also have a link on our website that directly links to it.
And Just Outcomes.
Yeah.
And I posted the link to that book on CJI's website to the answered section of the questions. And I have also gathered all the links that were discussed throughout this webinar, and we'll post those on the same page where the recording of this webinar will appear, which is actually going to be the same page that you use to register for this webinar. We'll just update it with all that information.
Great. All right. Well, thanks to all of you. Thank you for the participants who have sat in here and for your questions, and for the three of you presenting. It's really good to see you, and maybe we'll have to get on Skype and continue this conversation sometime.
Absolutely.
I hope the rest of the day goes well, and thank you so much. And I hope to see some of you all on some of our future webinars. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.